Cairo. I welcome you all to the 15th Edward Said Memorial Lecture of 2019. We try to have such lectures, Edward Said Memorial Lectures, coincide with the birthday of Edward Said on the 1st of November. To underline, we are celebrating his life and his continuous presence in our world and in the world of scholarship. Edward Said was close to our department and to AUC. He had been invited to ECLT, our department, and AUC as distinguished visiting professor several times, and his lectures were always scholarly events attended by hundreds, nay, thousands of his admirers. Since he passed away in 2003, we organized a memorable celebration of his life and accomplishments in the year 2004. And since then, we initiated a memorial lectures in his name. Here are the keynote speakers of Edward Said Memorial Lectures since the year 2005. Professor David Damrosch from Columbia and Harvard. Professor Barbara Harlow from Texas University. Professor Cornel West from Princeton and Harvard. Professor Terry Eagleton from Manchester University and Oxford University. Professor Rokus de Groot, University of Amsterdam. Professor Judith Butler, University of California at Berkeley. Professor John Carlos Rowe, University of Southern California. Professor Michael Wood from Princeton. Professor Sari Maqdisi, University of California at Los Angeles. Professor Marina Warner, Dame Marina Warner, University of London. Professor Lila Abulod, Columbia University. Professor Sulaiman Jen, Columbia University. Professor Osama Maqdisi, Rice University. Professor Robert Young, New York University. Professor Wadie Said from South Carolina. And next year, inshallah, 2020, we are going to have Raja Shahade, Palestinian, also a law specialist. The speakers that I mentioned cover different disciplines and all have been inspired by Said's thought and ideas. We have had scholars in literature, philosophy, critical theory, music, visual studies, anthropology, history, and now law. Today, our guest speaker is Wadie Edward Said, professor of law at the University of South Carolina in the US. Wadie was educated at Princeton, Columbia, and AUC in the CASA program. He has received several scientific awards and honors and has published extensively on international law, political asylum, and human rights. He is the author of the book, Crimes of Terror, the Legal and Political Implications of Federal Terrorism Prosecutions, published by Oxford University Press in 2015 and reprinted in an updated edition in 2018. Professor Wadie Said has also served as public defender and counsel in the case of US versus Al-Aryan et al. Today's lecture of Wadie Said is entitled Edward Said, Teachings, Familial and Otherwise. Since the title includes familial, allow me to comment on how I came to know Wadie. Not only I knew Wadie when he was a student in CASA in the year 94-95, is that correct? At AUC, but also I knew him first in the 1970s, when he was an infant. I was a student of Edward Said at the time, and Edward invited students in his seminar for tea in his place. And there was Maryam and baby Wadie. One last thing. Wadie is not only Ibn Edward Said, the son of Edward Said, he is also Abu Edward Said, the father of Edward Said. Let's welcome him.
Well, thank you very much, Riel, for that lovely introduction and for also inviting me, as well as the Department of English and Comparative Literature, in addition to AUC more generally, for, as you heard, hosting this event on an annual basis. It's a great honor for me and for my family on a personal level. And on that note, I'd also like to acknowledge the presence here of my mom, my aunts, and several cousins who've made the trip over here from Beirut, Amman, and Kuwait, respectively. This honor is not merely because the lecture series carries the name of my father, but also, as Ferial was mentioning, I was a student here 25 years ago in the CASA program where I really and properly learned Arabic. Before coming here, I probably could have put together a few sentences in Levantine colloquial Arabic, maybe read the newspaper if you gave me a dictionary, but after my year here at CASA, I could actually speak, read, and write Arabic properly, and astonishingly to me, converse in the Cairene dialect. That's gotten a little weaker over the years. But so here I wanted to recognize the two teachers in the CASA program. I've never done this, and I never told them this, but I want to make sure I do. The two teachers in the CASA program who had the greatest impact on me. One is Azza Wakid, who insisted that I learn Cairene Arabic. I was reluctant to speak in a different dialect and didn't want to mix dialects. But it was a required part of the program, and I was going to get an F if I didn't do the work, so it's good that I did it. More importantly, I was too young and rigid at first to grasp the importance of being familiar with the most spoken of the Arabic dialects, and Azza made sure that I didn't get in my own way. She also had one of the strongest and most effective responses by a teacher I've ever heard to student obfuscation. Now that I've been teaching for some 14 years, I know about student obfuscation. So one of the most amazing responses I've ever heard. It also, by the way, breaks the mystique regarding the supposed, sorry, I got a loud voice, so I'm sure you can hear me anyway. The supposed impenetrability of Arabic as a language somehow more difficult than others. When a student would say that our 8 a.m. class was too early in the morning to speak Arabic, she would say, listen, Egyptians speak Arabic at all hours of the day. Why is it too early for you? Right? This is a very important point, because if you go to the United States, for example, oh, Arabic, so difficult, so hard to understand, so strange and different. It's not true. It's a language like any other. I mean, the Fusha Amiya thing, it takes a little extra time, but it's part of what my father was talking about, I think, in Orientalism. Us being Arabs being different and hard to understand, mysterious, and therefore more somehow dangerous. The second teacher who influenced me profoundly was Nadia Harb, who I'm happy to say is here this evening. She taught me modern standard Arabic, or Fusha, over the course of my year in Cairo. And in her class, we covered many classics of the modern Arab novel, and it was there that I really learned how to read Arabic properly. I didn't realize it then, but looking back, to have a teacher of Nadia's caliber, who also happened to be Palestinian, made the critical difference for me. I didn't want to let her down, and this was the first time I was taught by one of us who also had the respect and admiration of a class of American students who, I'm not sure how many of you remember this, but they were at the time in the 90s just coming out of a long period of conditioning of Americans to think of Palestinians as some kind of dangerous terroristic other. And for our teacher and authority figure to be Palestinian was very important for me. I want to recognize her and Azza at this point and extend my profound thanks for their formative role in my education. Coming here to Cairo was a decision heavily influenced by my father, because I indicated initially I might prefer to study in Beirut or Amman, and he told me in no uncertain terms that it would be a mistake to do so. Cairo is the most important city in the Arab world, he said. The dialect is understood all around the region. Why would you go somewhere where you would just let your family take care of you and not challenge yourself? So I agreed, and I never regretted the decision. Toward the end of my residence in Cairo, I felt that it was too soon to leave the region and start law school in the United States. So I deferred my studies for a year and chose to spend that time in Palestine, which I'd only been to on one occasion in 1992, and that's a trip that my father wrote about for Harper's Magazine, as it was his first trip back since 1947, the year he left. And that trip was also the subject of a one-woman play my sister wrote and performed, so it has been much commented on by other immediate family members, so no need for me to add my reflections there. But I felt I needed to try and live in Palestine to hopefully offer something. What it ended up being was mostly translation services to some NGOs on a volunteer basis, more or less. But also to come to know the people and the nature of occupation in light of the coming of the Palestinian Authority. At this point, in 1995, my father had been writing critically of the Oslo Accords for around 2 years, as many of you assuredly remember, given that his English language articles appeared in each issue of Al-Ahram Weekly. So his reaction was one of surprise, mostly. Live in Palestine? Really? Well, Wadie, if that's what you want to do, I suppose it might be a good experience. I think he was reassured by the presence of his best friend, Ibrahim Abu Lughod, in Ramallah, the town where I would be living. But as I lived there and reported on my comings and goings on a sort of weekly phone call to my parents, I realized that by being in Palestine, I could offer him a window on life there that he otherwise didn't have. Criticizing the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli occupation would only become more forceful and effective with regular updates on the latest round of outrages and mismanagement by the Palestinian Authority. In addition, I served as a kind of on-the-ground fact-checker. While visiting my friend Muhammad, who is now an academic in France, at his family home in Rafah in the Gaza Strip, my father got in touch with a message. I've heard Abu Ammar has banned my books in Gaza. Can you find out if it's true? So Muhammad and I went to a bookstore he knew in Rafah, which was likely to have my father's books, and asked the shopkeeper, do you have any books by Edward Said? With the Egyptian border just right there, only a few yards away, the shopkeeper replied, oh, no, those books are banned. We can't sell them. We turned to leave, mildly incredulous, but resigned to the news. After a brief pause, the shopkeeper turned to us and said, if you need those books, maybe come back later this afternoon, we can have them for you. His people recognized the importance of his work, and no ham-fisted attempt to ban his books would stop them from reading it. My time in Palestine also enabled him to visit the country more easily. He could now rely on his son to rent a car, arrange a cell phone, this was in the era when you needed to rent a cell phone, and also function as a kind of fixer. Whenever someone asked to meet with him, he would always say, talk to Wadie and make sure he has your number. Not that I asked for that role, or was particularly good at it, as it engendered no shortage of people who were frustrated that I was never able to arrange a meeting with him. He had the final say, after all. But I did manage to connect him with people he would not necessarily have met, people of my own age, who had their own experiences of the duality of frustration that the Oslo era ushered in. No longer was there a direct confrontation with the soldiers of the occupation. Now there was a Palestinian Authority whose functionaries, officers, and agents seemed mostly focused on enriching themselves, self-aggrandizement, and exercising power on those without any. Being able to introduce him to individuals who suffered at the hands of both power structures, the Palestinian, by the way, entirely dependent on and subsidiary to the Israeli, fueled his sense of righteous indignation at the continued indignity his people had to endure, entirely without justification. My father wrote about this in a 1996 article for the London Review of Books entitled On Visiting Wadie. And it was at this moment where the only path forward for a just future for the region emerged for him. Here I need to mention the first of my father's closest Israeli friends. Probably most of you know about his friendship and collaboration with the world-famous conductor and pianist Daniel Barenboim, a partnership that has resulted in a combined project of Arab-Israeli youth orchestra and musical education in Palestine that my mother continues to oversee over 16 years after his death. However, for many years, beginning in the 1970s, my father corresponded with a man named Israel Shah, a distinguished professor of organic chemistry at the Hebrew University, a Holocaust survivor, and an anti-Zionist dissident, who for many years compiled and translated a newsletter into English entitled From the Hebrew Press. which he distributed on a regular basis to friends and supporters around the world. My father made regular visits in the 1990s to Shah's apartment on number 2 Bartanura Street in West Jerusalem. By the way, what was interesting about our time in Palestine was that both he and I rarely spent any time in West Jerusalem, even though he was born there. And I quickly learned the route to get there from Ramallah or East Jerusalem. In the spring of 1996, Shah told my father that he wanted to take him on an important trip, but they needed a car. No problem, my father said. Wadie has rented us one and can drive for us. Well, the trade-off, by the way, was that I got to use the car whenever I liked when he was done for the day or evening, so it wasn't a complete loss. In any event, we picked Shah up and he took us around the entirety of the greater Jerusalem area in the West Bank. What we saw was shocking. A ring, this is 1996, so at this time it wasn't well understood. A ring of settlements stretched out around the hills and valleys surrounding Jerusalem. There was no way a future Palestinian state could geographically have its capital in East Jerusalem, with this massive physical barrier that took the shape of multiple and separate municipalities, preventing any growth of the Palestinian populated sector of the city. Look, Edward, he said, the only way this will go away is if there's a cataclysm or war. Otherwise, the settlements are staying. And think what that means for any future Palestinian state. Whatever else the Palestinian predicament signifies, the central issue is that of land and who controls it. There it was, in starkest and clearest form. The Israelis weren't intending to leave the West Bank, but nor at the same time were the Palestinians willing to renounce their claims to live in all of historic Palestine, whether they were refugees, West Bankers, Jerusalemites, Gazans, or Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. Never Israeli Arabs or Arab Israelis, by the way. While he did not invent the idea, he certainly revived the one-state model as the way forward, and I think the trip with Shah crystallized it for him. He later gave the keynote address at the March 1999 meeting of the Israeli Anthropological Association in Nazareth. Yes, I drove him there too. The town of his mother's birth, in which he made his case for a one-state solution plain to an Israeli audience. If you don't accept it, he said, you're headed down the path to apartheid and fascism. History will show, I believe, that his path of a shared future on an undivided land is the only way forward. In the 16 years since his passing, I've often reflected on what life would be like if he were still here with us, as well as his influence on me directly. Clearly, my path as a public defender, as Faryad mentioned, and academic is the direct result of his own work. Beginning with the 1968 essay, The Arab Portrayed, and on through Orientalism, obviously, and covering Islam most directly, challenging stereotypes and clear misconceptions about who is a terrorist according to the law. My own work has its home directly in my father's endeavors. Further, my identification with those who seem to be in a hopeless situation, legally speaking, derives from his own relentless advocacy of causes deemed unpopular and peoples who were and remain vilified. This was a lived reality, by the way. Even on a personal level, at my wedding, for example, my father addressed those in attendance and congratulated me and my wife, whose father is from 2 neighborhoods over from his in Jerusalem and whose mother is from Ireland. He congratulated my wife and me for managing to bring together 2 of history's great losers, the Palestinians and the Irish. Finally, I think I was also greatly affected by his willingness to subject easy tropes and the conventional wisdom to searching scrutiny and criticism, no matter how inconvenient. My work on terrorism prosecutions, for example, is deeply critical of those criminal prosecutions of individuals with terrorism, charged with terrorism-related offenses in the United States, which, by the way, is in itself a challenge to the closely held liberal American position that federal court prosecution is highly preferable to military trials in the Guantanamo Bay sense. Yes, of course that's true, but resigning ourselves to choosing between the worst outcome and a slightly less bad outcome was never the point of his critical approach, and that's something I will always maintain. Were he still here, we would be buoyed by his incredible ability to articulate what we are thinking and feeling about a given issue. And I think his mere presence would have seen off some of the attacks on people in the academy associated with his views, quite frankly. Certainly, he would have been able to help thwart the outside campaigns against the tenure cases of certain professors at his own university. And I would also like to believe that on a much smaller scale, he might have been able to prevent a campaign against my own candidacy that I experienced many years ago for a faculty position when I was on the academic job market. Okay, there are other cases, and we can never know what may have happened had he been here, but that is my feeling. Perhaps more important to me is the personal side. In writing this talk, it saddened me to think that I had to mine the depths of interactions from so long ago. Much has happened since the Oslo Accords and our trips together to Palestine and elsewhere that I would love to discuss with him, as I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, would, so as to hear his insights, perspective, and analysis. And so much has happened since my wedding, as there are those things I would wish he could have seen, like the birth of his grandchildren, and my own professional accomplishments, and let's be frank here, my own struggles, as well as the trips we could have taken, tennis matches we could have played, etc. These are things any child deals with upon the loss of a parent. And in that sense, it's a bit strange that the memory of Edward Said, the public intellectual and great figure, tends to subsume the personal side. Of course, I do not want to suggest that he was omnipotent or more powerful than he was, as he understood the limits of his abilities most acutely. This really hit home in 1998 in the Q&A after a talk he gave at Bethlehem University. A man came up to the podium or up to the microphone to ask a question, really make a comment. He came and he started talking about the psychological effects his son felt after the traumatic experience that the boy had had at the hands of Israeli soldiers, and discussed these symptoms that the boy was having. What could he do for him? The man asked. My father demurred. He was unnerved. I'm not Superman, he said. It's not fair to ask me things that are best answered by mental health professionals. I'm sorry for what he experienced, but I don't know what to say. He was also stung by the fact that the September 11, 2001 attacks in America seemed to make him an overly controversial figure once more. As he told me shortly before he died, look, Wadie, I was given many honorary degrees in the United States before that date, and since then I haven't received any. He was stung by the decision of King's College at Cambridge University to decline to make him an honorary fellow in the last year of his life. And I think more importantly, he agonized greatly, both publicly and privately, over his inability to stop the United States from invading Iraq in 2003. But rather than ending on a negative note, I'd like to stress the positive nature of his legacy. He provided a clear and shining example of how to work for what you felt was important. And he identified worthy goals we can all work towards. When he referenced the poem by Aimé Césaire, Notebook of a Return to My Native Land, about a place for all at the rendezvous of victory, he truly meant it. Further, in his personal conduct, he never hesitated to help people who are committed to being ethical academics and upholding the responsibility that such positions brought. He never declined to help someone because they might gain fame or notoriety and constitute a threat to his own standing. That's a phenomenon, unfortunately, I've experienced all too much in the years since he died. These are lessons I choose to remember, along with the example of a father who tried to show me the way, and I resisted for sure. For example, I'm now having the same conversation with my own son, as Priyad mentioned, named after his grandfather, about the benefits of being prepared in sports and academic endeavors, and playing your game, so to speak, no matter what others say. I wish he'd just understand what I'm saying. Don't make the same mistakes I did. I didn't listen to my father. I'm sure he'll get it, but it's frustrating now. And prior to my own children being born, I didn't know that I was prouder than that one day we were at a conference in Gaza. And please excuse my celebration of the patriarchy here. But the late Dr. Haidar Abdushafi said to those assembled, let's hear what Abu Wadie has to say. He and I looked at each other and we both smiled. It was my honor to give this talk this evening and be here with you, and thanks very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Wadie, for telling us all about the family secrets. Now we open the discussion. If anyone has comments or questions.
مرحبا وديع.
مرحب.
Can I address you in Arabic since it is my mother language?
أهلا وسهلا.
Okay. وديع، أنا قريت عدة مرات قريت كتاب الاستشراق. والحقيقة أعتقد إن ده يعني طبعا مش أنا أعتقد، مش لازم أقول هو قد إيه مهم الكتاب، ولكن يعني أنا بفكر طول الوقت كيف ممكن إحنا نقدر نلخص الدروس الأساسية في هذا الكتاب المهم بحيث نقدر للنشء الجديد يفهموا الكلام الصعب اللي فيه. النسخة العربية أنا قريتها وكانت صعبة علي، أنا قريته بالإنجليزي أساساً. هل يمكن يخطر على بالكم أنه تعملوا مشروع يطلع الدروس الرئيسية في هذا الكتاب ويوصل للشباب اللي هم ما بين ال 18 وال 30 مثلاً؟ لأنه كثير من الأشياء اللي خاصة تجري الآن زي التعابير العظيمة، النظام العالمي الجديد والقرية الكونية إلى آخره، كل ده لازم يوصل للشباب، والشباب صعب عليهم يقروا كتاب مثل هذا من هذا النوع، من هذا المستوى، مش من هذا النوع. فهل يا ترى فكرت عائلة أدوارد سعيد أو باتصالاتها بكل المفكرين إنه يطلع كتاب باللغة العربية يضم أهم الدروس في تكوين كيف اللغة والأدب وغيره تكون الوجدان وتغير؟ أنا بقول هذا الكلام لأن أنا عندي أحفاد ويهمني إنه يفهموا اللي أنا فهمته من الكتاب بشكل أبسط. شكرا.
أوكي. شكرا جزيلا على السؤال. يعني أعتقد أن أولا الكلام هو أعتقد أنه من الأفضل أن يوجه إلى الوالدة اللي هي مسؤولة على نشر الكتب باللغة العربية، لكن أنا ممكن أقول في الوقت هذا أنه في ترجمة جديدة على الخط جاي، فأعتقد أنه النص الجديد أو الترجمة الجديدة قد تسهل في قراءة الكتاب عند القراء، يعني لأن أعرف أنه كان هناك، مع احترامي الشديد جدا للدكتور كمال أبو ديب، يعني كان هناك بعض التساؤلات على الترجمة الأصلية، بسبب ذلك هناك ترجمة جديدة آتية. هنا أتردد في الكلام عن تلخيص أو يعني تصنيف أفكار، تبسيط الأفكار. أعتقد أن كان الوالد يعني كان لو كان معنا كان اعترض على هذا الموضوع لعدة أسباب. هنا أريد أن أتوقف عن التعليق لأن يعني من المستحيل أن أتكهن ماذا كان سوف يقول لو كان موجود، لكن هذا كلامي يعني لحد الآن، أنه هناك ترجمة جديدة قد يعني تسهل في القراءة مستقبلا، بينما الموضوع الثاني محتاج إلى حد، ولكن شكرا على السؤال.
I think what Maysoon is asking, I think it's a very important thing.
Did I answer it wrong?
No, you said it, no.
Okay.
There's no wrong or right. But I want to say I taught a course just on Edward Said, you know. And I find that even students who are advanced students find him difficult to understand, you know. So I think what we need to do is, I don't know what to say, nationalize him or present him.
I do have, sorry not to cut you off, but I forgot to mention one thing.
Yeah.
There is an intellectual history of Edward Said coming out,
yes.
written by his,
yes.
his former student, Tim Brennan.
Tim Brennan.
That will be out in the next year or two.
Yes.
And, having read drafts of it, the stuff on the French philosophers, I'm like an absolute zero, so don't ask me about if that helps or not. But on Palestine, on Orientalism, etc., I think the discussion is quite rich and quite detailed. So that also might provide, it doesn't help for the Arabic language readers so much.
In contrast, the articles that Edward Said wrote in Al-Ahram Weekly, and that appeared actually in Arabic as well, were very accessible and had the richness
Well,
Isn't it hard to find them?
maybe we need to put them together.
They were published here by Muhammad Fayed in Egypt. They were published in 2 books. Dar al-Adab, yeah.
Other question, Hani, micro.
I actually want to pick up a little bit on these 2 aspects of Edward Said's legacy as an academic and as a public intellectual. I remember when I first read Orientalism, I was stunned by, what a rigorous academic book it is. And as a matter of fact, if you're not interested in the disciplinary project that Edward Said has, you would find the book sometimes very, very tedious. The close readings of texts and analysis and the deployment of many protocols of literary criticism on those texts. I'm interested, now that you are an academic too, so how can you theorize or explain or describe this transition from Edward Said, the very rigorous academic, to Edward Said, the public intellectuals? I mean, not all academics end up becoming public intellectuals. And then ultimately, there is some, if you look at Noam Chomsky, he's an academic, but nobody knows anything he's done in linguistics, but everybody knows him about that something else. But Edward Said is different in the sense that there is a way, some kind of a line that actually can be traced between his very rigorous academic work and his role as a public intellectual. So as an academic, I mean, how do you think about these 2 aspects of his legacy?
Well, thank you very much for the question. That's a very interesting question because, when you're teaching a class in criminal law and criminal procedure, Edward Said doesn't come up much. As annoyed as he would be that, what do you mean, Wadie? You're not, anyway. But in all seriousness, I think that what I've tried to do is reflect on those kind of moments, whether this is also, by the way, true for my practice. When you're defending people who are charged with terrorism crime, the level of intentional obfuscation and denigration that the prosecution, the federal government is going to present. And I think the real lesson that I learned is, let's be honest, Orientalism is still with us. I mean, the Egypt Air flight I came over on, they had there were 2 movies, one of which was the remake of Aladdin, which is just as Orientalist as the old one, right? And the other one was one that I managed to watch, a very violent movie, kind of silly movie called John Wick, where in the end John Wick ends up in Morocco, where everyone is wearing a jilbab and etc. in Casablanca, which is a very modern city, and it's completely Orientalized in this very strange way. I don't know what the point of it was really. So Orientalism is still with us, and I think when I try to teach, to the extent that these issues come up, usually through the prism of a kind of who's a terrorist and things like that, something that I'll talk about a little bit more in my lecture on Monday, which is more kind of academic and legally focused. But things like the way Arab names are rendered in cases, in prosecution. Abu Ali becomes United States versus Ali. What happened to the Abu? I mean, you wouldn't say United States versus John, right? If for someone whose name was Johnson. I mean, the level of kind of casual disdain that there is for the kind of the makeup of Arabs and Arab culture, it has to be combated on so many levels. And I use that word combat with trepidation, but I do feel that there is a kind of an almost like a warlike, a sort of intentional misappreciation of who we are as a people, even in the even if we're resident in the United States and long-term residents, long-term citizens, etc. So I feel that that's something we kind of, I have to think about and try to explain to my students, especially in a place like South Carolina, that there are these stereotypes that are deeply hostile, and they, but for me to just come and beat them over the head, I don't think will always work. So I have to kind of think of ways to do it. Islam and Sharia law, which is a contradiction in terms, by the way. You don't need law if you say Sharia. Like things like that, to point it out to them, how ignorant that this whole discourse is. And I think that's part of how I take the lessons of, like you said, Orientalism, which is in many instances very dense, very hard to get through, and try to make it relatable. Not that I'm the great expert or authority, no, but just this is what I understand of it, and try to kind of present it in that way.
May I was just wondering, you've actually sort of touched on it a little bit just now. Your own work, where you've done and are doing very distinguished work in pointing out what's wrong with the war on terror and what's wrong with talking about terrorists and so on. I'm in a way, of course, that also follows on from the legacy of Edward Said. I was wondering, you've said you're going to talk about it on Monday, but I was wondering whether you might just tell us a tiny bit about it now and relate it to him. And also, was he, I mean, how far had you gone down that road while he was still alive? Was he aware?
Okay, so yes, thank you very much, Ahdaf, for the question. Because I did obviously struggle with the idea of how much am I going to bring my own work into it, especially with another lecture on the way. I think, it's very interesting because I think he was always bemused by this idea that he's somehow an expert in terrorism, and even when it was well-intentioned, which is how I sort of got into this type of work, is that there was a very distinguished lawyer, an anti-death penalty lawyer, death penalty defense lawyer, who, had a mutual contact with my father, and he had been appointed to defend one of the guys who blew up the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi in 1998, which was at the time a death penalty case. And his friend, his contact was a colleague of my father's called Monroe Engel, and Monroe said, "Why don't you should talk to Edward." So he did, and my father said, I mean, I don't know the first thing about death penalty cases and blowing up embassies. I'm not an expert on this. And my son is a law student, if you're interested. Maybe he would talk to you. And it turned out that there was a role for me in the short time the client, a Saudi national who was later convicted and given a life sentence, only could speak Arabic. And the lawyers obviously couldn't. So I worked in that capacity, kind of we went to the, where Jeffrey Epstein hanged himself. That's where we went, to the most secure part of the federal holding facility in downtown Manhattan. And we talked to this Saudi guy who blew up the U.S. Embassy. And without, of course, commenting on guilt or innocence, he was proven guilty, or any confidences, it struck me, how there was a whole system in place for trying terrorists that was even more, how shall I put it, repressive. And while that was a case involving clear violence and dead bodies, and it was a very difficult case for sure, but the infrastructure was in place to even go after people for their ideas, and nonviolent people who had ideas or were engaged in advocacy. And that sort of case served as an entree into that world, even though, like I said, it was clearly a violent case. Because my father was bemused. I mean, when he was I was stuck in Westchester County on the day of the 9/11 attack, which is the county north of New York. My wife was actually at my parents' apartment with my dad. My mother was at work in Midtown. And as soon as the attack came, the phone started ringing off. And, my wife was answering, and, what do you want me to do? Hang up on them. He said, I don't know anything about people who, fly planes, skyscrapers. It's ridiculous. What am I going to tell you? What am I going to tell the media? And so I think he had, he understood that these portrayals were there, and that they needed to be combated. But when it came to operational intelligence, insights into the mind of a terrorist, he said no. He said, I won't do that. And that's the thing that I think been interesting for me, because, for example, when I was working on the case of the United States versus Iran, we had 4 defendants and me, right? Everyone else looked different, but I looked like, I used to say, I looked like the 5th defendant. right? So it's very interesting the fine line you walk between combating stereotypes, combating injustice, unfair portrayals, but also not being kind of a part of illegality, that's a fine line to walk. And that was what I kind of, I took it from him, but I also recognized that he wasn't in that world either.
ممكن أسأل بالعربي؟ من 2003 لغاية دلوقتي حصلت تحولات عديدة في العالم والمنطقة العربية تحديدا بتجعلنا نفتقد آراء إدوارد سعيد نفسه. لنتخيل لو إدوارد سعيد موجود دلوقتي، في تقديرك إيه كان هيكون موقفه من الثورات العربية اللي في المنطقة من تونس لمصر من خلال يعني معرفتك العميقة بيه كابن ليه؟ هل كان هينزل معانا ميدان التحرير مثلا او هيروح يعتصم في بيروت او حاجة زي كده؟
شكرا على السؤال، لأنه التكهن هذا اختصاصي الثاني. لا أنا لا، السؤال مقدر وأشكرك عليه، بس أنا مش يعني حقيقة يعني لا أستطيع أن يعني أجيب بدقة. طبعا هو تصور إلى حد كبير، لكن طبعا أعتقد أنه كان يعني يصف مع الشارع ومع الشعب بشكل عام. هذا يعني كان أعتقد هذا شيء ممكن نتوقعه لو كان معنا. هل هو ينزل ويعتصم؟ يعني هناك مشاهد في الماضي في أمريكا عندما كان ينزل إلى الشارع ويخاطب الجماهير فيما يتعلق بموضوع الحقوق الفلسطينية، حق العودة مثلا. لكن يعني استحالة الجواب هنا تأتي بسبب يعني التدهور الصحي الذي اختبره في نهاية عمره. يعني فلا أستطيع أن أميز بين إدوارد سعيد يعني الرجل الذي عرفته في آخر أيامي عندما كان يعني يتدهور وصحيا لم يستطع أن يكون حاضرا كيفما كان، كيفما أراد. فهذا يعني كان مؤيدا 100%، لكن عن نشاطاته هو يعني لا أدري. I'm sorry, I'll just briefly kind of add that, trying to imagine what he would have done is I think difficult, obviously, and I'm not a soothsayer by any means, but I do think that he would have supported these sort of popular uprisings, and I think his voice would have been extremely important, for all of us. I'll speak for myself, but I don't think it's unfair to speak collectively, or for the collective at least to a fair degree. But I think he did also recognize the limits of what he could do, and he wasn't able to make magic happen. And that scene that I talked about, that in Bethlehem, that really I think affected him, because he's not a medical doctor or a magician, or he can't treat everything. He was there as an inspirational figure, and translating it into reality or into a practical kind of application was something that he struggled with. It's interesting. Can I make a further comment? Sure. Sorry, I don't mean to cut off the discussion, but it's very interesting. On the this is a point. I'm sorry, I'll make it in English because, and I can elaborate later in Arabic if necessary. But hopefully the point is made. One thing I have found exceptionally hard to deal with is people who kind of speak for him, speak in his name, in ways that you wouldn't expect. What do I mean? Well, there I was reading, I think it was in the New Yorker, where the editor-in-chief of the New Yorker, David Remnick, brought up a quote from my father from a 2000 interview he did with a fellow called Ari Shavit, a journalist at Haaretz, who, after this interview, he became even more anti-Palestinian than he already was. it's an amazing interview that I recommend everyone read if they can, where he kind of thumbs his nose at Shabit and tells him, look, I'm the last Jewish intellectual, the last true follower of Adorno, right? It's the famous interview for those of you who followed his work. But the thing that's amazing is David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, one of the more important of the American kind of weekly periodicals, says, my father noted, Shabit asked him, what happens to the Jews, to the Israeli Jews in a future one-state solution? My father said, yes, I'm worried about that. I think not because he was intending to commit a second genocide, but because he was, that was something that obviously needed to be worked out before any solution. So Remnick used it against him. That how can we have BDS and one state when even Edward Said himself was worried about the future of the Holy Land? It's not right. It's not right. And another fellow who's been struggling with his Zionism, as well as a guy called Peter Boehnert, who was with the New Republic for a long time. He's also been struggling with the issue of BDS and Zionism, and not prepared to say he's anti-Zionist. He quoted the same passage. Said Edward Said is concerned. Why shouldn't we be scared about the future? That's not his message at all. He envisioned the future. People say sometimes he was too soft with his humanism, willingness for coexistence, that maybe he was prepared to give up principles. That's the thing, is that we don't know what he would have said. We don't know what he would have thought. Because I think, complexity, I don't want to be here just as a translator for my father or a filter, but I do think it's part of the importance of his legacy that there was some complexity, a great deal of complexity. So to know how he would have responded, I can only kind of attempt to address it, but I can't say with any certainty.
So in the discourse of shedding light on stereotypes and trying to clarify the errors that are inherent to them, do you think that today some sort of political correctness and how it's dealt with might obscure the conversation that may clarify those stereotypes and create some healthy conversation? Could the way that we deal with political correctness get in the way of conversation and educating one another?
I mean, sure, anytime you have something that's just, superficial. I mean, the term political correctness is obviously a loaded term, which speaks to kind of superficially handling an issue as opposed to getting to the heart of it. If it's just superficial, yeah, I could see how that's problematic. But, I mean, I think that when you start to, kind of dehumanize or other a culture, it manifests itself in these ways that seem not that important. My students kind of look at me like, why have we, in a class on, criminal procedure, why have we started to talk about Arabic names? And like, we didn't come here to learn Arabic. But I do think that there's a relationship between the respect given and the lack of respect shown and the discourse and the underlying ideas that push these types of prosecutions. So I think I think it's more than just political correctness. I think it's something deeper, pushing people to challenge. One of the things that was shocking to me was, and this was something was so easy to make hay of, and again in the Al Harian prosecution, the government put in all these translations. By the way, the craziest thing happened in this trial. The government's translators were, as I'm half Lebanese Christian, I guess I could say this, they were mostly Lebanese Christians, 3 of whom were former members of the Lebanese Forces Militia, which is kind of phalangists. Yeah, they're fascist, anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim. These are the translators they got. One of the guys in his resume said he was, director of intelligence, whatever. And he got up on the stand. Anyway, after his testimony, he came up to me. He said, "Is Wadie, بدي بس بدك يعني تعزينا على وفاة والد كان كثير." This guy is trying to put my client away for life, and he's, completely didn't understand what Edward Said stood for. But he's, I guess he was a big figure for him. It was a very strange moment. But the point is, in the trial, the government introduced all sorts of transcripts purportedly showing how terroristic and violent and awful the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was, as if it had anything, as if these, discussions had anything, or these, political pamphlets had anything to do with what my client had to say. Another story for another day. But all these translations were, were basically like, we will kill the infidel wherever they are in the Holy Land of Palestine, something like that. The next line of the line after it would say, we're struggling against occupation and the dispossession of our people. So it was so easy to go to him and I say, you see this line right above it in Arabic? What does that say? And he would say, it says we should be, how come you didn't translate that, right? They didn't, they want to give a selective picture of, and that's, again, something that's very easy to do. I mean, you need to know Arabic, but still, it's kind of necessary work that gets completely, pushed to the side once the government starts to try to prosecute advocacy in the United States. And this, again, is something I'm talking about. It's more than just superficial. It's deeper, I think.
Circle back again to this question of understanding the world or changing it that seems to have occupied us in the questions. So in your talk, you presented two moments. One where Edward Said is presented with an agonizing question about what to do. And, he abjures judgment because he lacks sort of technical knowledge as you presented it. But faces agonizing questions himself over the Second Gulf War, etc. So, from a student-centric point of view, students who are young, who don't necessarily have that vast knowledge, who have moral orientation or a moral stance, and are faced with agonizing questions that they can't dismiss as outside of their technical expertise. Did you have a solution for that, putting those two moments together? Agonizing questions that others ask us, but what about agonizing questions that we ask ourselves?
So I think the way to think about that is not that he was trying to kind of just run away from the issue, but more that those are bigger questions that, like in the case of the solution for Palestine, as a kind of as a figure offering a theory or offering a way forward. These are clearly things that need popular support, popular legitimacy, and there's no getting around the hard work of getting the support, campaigning for an idea and working for that popular support, for example. At which point, or during that process, things like the implementation can be discussed, right? But there's a certain kind of baseline of principles that you have to stick to. And I think that, as a person offering a kind of a vision, I don't know that he wanted to short-circuit the work by pretending he had all the answers. So I think that was very important. That's also something, in this day and age, we're very kind of tied to the superficial. Social media world, makes us grab it or asks us, demands that people grab attention for however long until the next thing. But there's no getting around that hard work, and I think he didn't want to short-circuit it. So he would kind of maybe retreat a little bit because there were some issues of technocratic issues that were hard for him to answer, about writing constitution, things like that, and drafting principles. And I think he was a little, hesitant to get involved. I don't know sort of what the message is to students other than to challenge them to think critically, right? Because I think another thing that was important about my father's legacy that I often, because I confront this issue too. I mentioned the issue about terrorism prosecution versus Guantanamo Bay military tribunal. So what's the answer? I don't know. I don't have the answer other than be less unjust, right? And I try to argue against, unjust laws and things like that. But am I going to come up with a new court system or a new set of laws? First of all, no one will listen. Second of all, I don't know that it can be done. So I think there is value in being critical for criticism's sake. and then hopefully solutions will present themselves, not prevent. So I think that's I think part of the approach.
Do you see a development in the trajectory of Edward Said? Did he become more radical with time? I mean, we know the change that happened in '67. He became aware of Palestine, and before that, all his work had nothing to do with Palestine or even with politics and so on. But there was a point when he was for two-state solution. Then he became for one-state solution, and so on. So do you see a kind of pattern?
You know, it's interesting. This is something that he could answer best in a book that late style book, right, yeah. Where he said he kind of commented on certain artists who became more difficult and harder to read and more impenetrable as they got older. I think maybe, I don't know if I should say this.
Say it.
I maybe disagree in that he kind of romanticized the kind of heroic nature of the artist growing older and more, the idea of late style is a bit romanticized, because I do think at the end he was really trying to kind of garner support, coalesce, and get people behind his ideas, and recognize that his role was one where he could speak for a lot of people who felt voiceless. I mean, the stuff about Iraq, I think he was here in Cairo when the invasion happened.
He gave a talk on the 18th.
On the 18th.
And the 20th was the invasion.
It really affected him, and he felt very compelled to take action, because he knew that he was in a position, he had a voice to do so, even if it was just giving voice to what, the vast majority of people around the world were thinking, right? I think he felt it was important. So I do think that on the one hand, there was this late style, more recalcitrant, more kind of contrapuntal, he liked to use that word, approach, but at the same time, I do think he also was looking to build support for his ideas and build consensus. So I think it was more of a duality.
Your talk. I have a question. It might be a little simplistic, but I'll ask it anyways. I wanted to ask you about you talked about the fact that Cambridge kind of refused to give him an honorary degree, and I wanted to ask you about how the pro-Palestinian discourse, this whole idea is talked about post 9/11 in the U.S. and how Palestinian scholars are perceived, and you especially, since you talk about terrorism and all of that in your work. Thank you.
With a Cambridge fellowship, or there were people who did not want to give it to him, and then it went through the certain procedure that they had, and after he died, we got a letter that they made him a fellow.
I think it's simplistic. I think you bring up a very, I think that it's gotten, what we've seen is a very weird thing, I think, in the United States, where in the academy, not in the legal academy where I teach, by the way, I'm not in the clear, don't think for a second, but in the sort of arts and sciences, or the humanities and social sciences, that's maybe a better way of saying it, understanding of the Palestinian cause is kind of more accepted. And there are people out there who are deeply embittered. They feel that Said won, right? And they think there's a guy who's just, I shouldn't mention his name, so horrible, called Martin Kramer, who's just obsessed with the idea of the fact that Said, managed to grab a hold of the American Academy, and what an incredible disservice, there was his debate, which, I think you can watch it on YouTube, his debate with Bernard Lewis in 1986, where he completely wiped the floor with him. And Lewis was embittered and only revived by 9/11, where he became Dick Cheney's favorite intellectual. These are the people he was against, and he kind of routed them in the academy because he was insistent on rigorous academic methods that showed respect for cultures, right? Not, advancing an imperial project. And I think what you're seeing in America is, as the humanities and the social sciences recognize this, more and more professors, right? There's now a huge controversy about BDS, where, you find a lot of support among the rank and file of the professoriate for BDS. Not universal, but much more than it's growing all the time. Meanwhile, the university itself becomes more corporatized, right? So the presidents and the provosts and the deans kind of shut down a lot of this activity. The federal government isn't happy about it, and there's all sorts of figures who've been appointed to oversee federal grants to education, and they threaten federal funding when if academics kind of speak up a little too much, especially in favor of BDS, which is, by the way, a constitutionally protected right. There's a 1982 Supreme Court case called Claiborne Hardware, which says you have a federally protected constitutional right to engage in a boycott. Boycott is a legitimate tactic, but that's, sorry, I digress. The point is that, it's a kind of a bitter moment where the ideas are taking shape, the legacy of Edward Said is there, and, you have this corporatization of the university with non-academics kind of cracking down on what academics can do, and more adjuncts as opposed to tenured position, people who are in a position to lose their job as opposed to a tenured academic who can only be fired for cause, etc. So it's a mixed bag where the ideas are gaining hold, but within those sort of corridors of power, they're struggling to break through.
I have a personal question, but it does resonate with some of the points you made earlier, because I did read Najla's beautiful 2013 memoir, Looking for Palestine. And throughout the memoir, she always makes this comparison between herself and you, where she always says that it was much easier for you to maybe harmonize or be in touch with both components of your identity, so the Arab American, and that this is something that you seem to inherit from Edward Said, while she, on the other hand, was always struggling with that. And it's interesting because earlier in your talk you mentioned that you resisted. He tried to show you the way, but you resisted. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about, like...
Oh yeah, no, I'm sorry, yes. I mean, my sister wrote about, as you said, she wrote about her own, obviously the legacy of my father is so large that obviously we struggle with it we struggle while we embrace it and celebrate it. Of course, I mean, we, meaning my sister and I, we also struggle with it. And, I do think that certainly, I'm of course here to, in many ways, celebrate and defend our culture. I also recognize that, as the son, it's a little bit easier. Like I mentioned, Abu Wadie as opposed to Abu Najla, right? There's a firstborn aspect to it. But yeah, I mean, I think we get the point. But with respect to that question, unfortunately, the answer is a little bit more mundane in that he was trying to tell me things that all fathers, this is the weird thing, right? Is that here I am at a talk, look, and everyone here has, read or heard of him or, seen him talk maybe, or, had some experience, and it's clearly transformational. I'm not going to deny that or try to, but at the same time, he was my father. So, like one thing I regret, whatever it is I managed to be a halfway decent tennis player. I played in college, right, on my team, on my school's varsity tennis team, which, there was a bit of a struggle to get there. And I did it, I'm not going to show you, of course, but I have a broken elbow. I broke my elbow at the age of 14, and there are 2 pins in there. They never came out. So I only had about 95% of my range of motion. And then by the time I was in my senior year of college, my arm kind of gave out. And I broke my elbow at a time when my father was urging me to get serious about tennis. And I was just goofing off. And what I ended up doing was one night I went with a friend of mine, and he had a freestyle bike, 2 jumps on the ramp, right? And I couldn't do them. I kept trying and failing. And on the last run of the night, my mother remembers this, of course, the last run of the night. It was a cold February night in New York City. I managed to do it. I took off on the bike. But then I went like this. And I landed on the I missed the grass by that much. I landed on the concrete, shattered my elbow. And I frequently think what would have happened, you know, if I had listened to my dad and taken tennis more seriously and not done crazy things like try to jump off a ramp on a bike in the middle of the city at night. You know, that was what I meant, really, honestly, is that I should have listened to him. You know, when he told me, there was one time I was playing for the championship of my high school association. I was going to be the champion of, you know, that association of schools. And he said, you know, I won the first 2 matches in the morning. We went out for lunch before the third match. And he said, you know, you should really eat something. And I was so excited I got to the final. He said, no, I'm good. No. Wadie, you really need to eat. You're 18 years old. You got to stop doing this. I got it, Dad. I got it. I'm feeling great. I get out there. I'm playing a guy who was a very, very good player, but I was ahead in the match. And my dad was a tennis fanatic too, so he was happy when I would do well. Unfortunately, I sometimes struggle, but I was up in the match. I was going to win. I was, you know, going to win the first set, and the guy, you know, and I basically missed an easy shot, and then all of a sudden, air came out of me. I had nothing left. Hadn't eaten, hadn't drunk anything, so I was exhausted, and he just steamrolled over me, you know. And I look back, and I'm like, my dad was telling me, eat, and I didn't do it. So that's why I'm insistent my son don't do that. So that's the thing, is I shouldn't really be telling this in front of a public forum. But this is the thing, is when your father is a public figure, lessons kind of get left out. You know, my sister wrote about stuff like that. I've never talked about things like that, and who knows if I ever will again, maybe. It's a weird, it illustrates the duality of having someone who can appear, you know, here in such a capacity 16 years after his death, and, you know, someone who's your dad.
Thank you very much. I just want to announce that there will be another lecture by Wadie Saeed in the new campus in Tajamal Khamis on Monday at 1 o'clock in Al-Alfi Hall. And it will be on legal classifications and their global impact, understanding American notions of terrorism. You're all welcome there too.